settle in and let your breathing slow, like cold air sinking into a wide, quiet valley. In your mind, you are standing on Yosemite's floor under pale moonlight, where the granite walls look solid, final, and permanent. But that is the comforting illusion. These cliffs are not the beginning of the story. They are what is left behind after long, patient damage. Not the quick kind either. The slow kind, ice moving like a heavy blanket, inch by inch, polishing stone the way time polishes worry. Tonight, with the Sleepless Geographer keeping watch, you will drift through glacial erosion and listen to a valley being shaped gently over thousands of quiet winters. The first thing you notice is the shape of the place, not the famous names, not the dramatic photographs, just the geometry. You are standing in a valley that feels wide in the shoulders, rounded at the edges. It does not pinch inward like a cut. It holds you like a bowl. If this were only a river story, you would expect a narrower space. Water, when it is young and eager, tends to slice downward. It makes a steep letter V, sharp enough to snag clouds. But here, the walls rise like smooth ramps that turn vertical, and the floor is broad enough to wander without purpose. That is your first quiet clue. You are not looking at a wound made by rushing water alone. You are looking at the leftovers of ice, a slow visitor that did not hurry, did not negotiate, and did not care what you wanted the valley to look like. Glaciers are not dramatic, up close. That is the strange part. You expect noise, or at least some theatrical cracking. But a glacier mostly behaves like an exhausted animal. It leans into the slope and simply keeps going. The ice in Yosemite was not one neat tongue, politely staying in its lane. During the colder pulses of the past, snow piled up year after year in the high country. The snow pressed into itself, and the air pockets slowly vanished. Soft flakes became dense ice, and dense ice became something heavier than your instincts can easily picture. Then gravity did what gravity always does. It took that weight and encouraged it downhill, not in a rush, more like a slow, continuous sigh. You can imagine it now, even in moonlight. A river of ice, thick and stubborn, filling the valley from wall to wall, not floating, pressing. It slides because ice can deform just a little under its own weight, and because meltwater, in small, secret amounts, can lubricate the base. So, the glacier moves, not fast enough to scare you, but fast enough to erase you. A pace measured in the length of a hand over a day, or a room over a season. Time becomes the real engine, and as it moves, it does not travel clean. A glacier is not pure white, not in its working parts. It is loaded with grit and stones and broken fragments, the way a boot sole collects sand. Those rocks get frozen into the ice, and they become tools. Congratulations, you are now standing inside the most patient construction project on Earth. There are no foremen, no blueprints, and no finish date. Just weight, motion, and stone being persuaded to change shape. The reason glaciers carve differently than rivers is simple and a little unfair. A river touches the ground with a narrow line of force. It cuts down, it deepens, it threads through weakness like a needle. But a glacier is wide. It is a whole body pressing against everything at once. It scrapes not only the center, but the sides. It rubs the valley walls the way a heavy dresser rubs paint off a hallway corner. Except the hallway is granite and the dresser weighs more than your imagination. That is how you get the U shape, not because the glacier is artistic, but because it is thorough. It cannot help but widen the space it occupies. It takes the old river valley, already carved into the mountains, and it recorrates it with blunt force and endless repetition. You can feel it even standing here now. The walls are too straight, too tall, too clean in places. El Capitan rising like a single thought that refused to soften. Half dome holding its rounded back against the sky. But you should not picture the glacier arriving to perfect, untouched stone. It came to a landscape with flaws already written into it, because granite, for all its confidence, has quiet weaknesses. Long before the ice, this valley began as deep heat. Granite is what happens when melted rock cools slowly underground, not on the surface where it can froth and crack, deep below where it has time to settle into a tight, interlocked structure. Over ages that do not fit inside a single human story, that granite rose closer to the surface. Mountains are not only built by pushing upward, they are also revealed by everything else being worn away. And granite, as it rises and unloads pressure, develops fractures. They are called joints, which makes them sound friendly. In reality, they are lines where the rock is ready to separate. They can be vertical, like tall pages in a book. They can be curved, like layers peeling from an onion. You do not need an earthquake to make a crack. Sometimes, you only need time and a little water with bad intentions. In the daytime, you see Yosemite as a place of bright stone and loud beauty. At night, you can imagine it as a place of small movements. Water slips into the joints, a thin film at first, then a deeper seep, then a hidden pocket. When cold comes, that water freezes, and freezing water expands, not politely. It pushes outward, prying the crack wider, millimeter by millimeter, winter by winter. This is frost wedging, a plain name for a stubborn process. No explosions, no drama, just a repeated, quiet insistence. Stone does not resist forever. It only resists until it does not. So blocks loosen, plates detach, boulders wait in awkward balance, held by friction and habit. And the cliffs you admire, the clean faces, the sudden drop-offs, they are partly a story of rock breaking along its own pre-written lines. You can see the evidence scattered at the base of the walls. Talus slopes made of angular debris. Not rounded river stones, these are sharp, fresh shapes, like broken teeth. Pieces that fell because gravity is patient too. And then, once the climate cooled enough for ice to return, the glacier found those weaknesses and used them. Because ice does not only polish, it also steals. Imagine the glacier filling the valley again, thickening until it presses into every hollow. It flows over bumps and around corners and into cracks that would normally be private. At the base, some of the ice melts under pressure. Not much, but enough to make a thin slick. The meltwater seeps into fractures, and when it refreezes, it bonds the ice to the rock. Then the glacier continues its slow downhill pull. The bonded rock does not always stay behind. Sometimes the ice simply takes it. This is called plucking. It sounds like something gentle, like picking a flower. In practice, it is the glacier grabbing a block of granite and yanking until the stone gives up, plucking leaves, sharp steps, and rough surfaces. Abrasion, on the other hand, is the smoothing part. That is when the rocks trapped in the ice grind along the bedrock like sandpaper that never wears out. You can picture it in an everyday way. A glacier is like a moving floor buffer the size of a city block. It does not care if the floor wants to stay shiny. It will polish it anyway. This is why, in some places in and around Yosemite, you find slabs that look brushed clean. Long, faint scratches run along them in the direction the ice once moved. Those scratches are striations, another simple name for a clear memory. You do not always see them easily now. Weathering softens the marks. So does dust and soil and plant life taking its time to move back in. But the shape remains. And the shape is the glacier's signature. In your mind, you walk slowly along the valley floor. The river is there, quieter than the walls. You hear it before you see it, a low shush moving through darkness. This river, the Merced, did not create the whole valley by itself. It is the tenant that moved in after a much larger force remodeled the house. Before the glacier, the Merced and its ancestors cut into the mountains, like all rivers do. They followed gravity, they followed weakness, and they carried away what they could. They carved a valley that was probably narrower and more V-shaped. Then the ice arrived and widened it. It deepened it too, but in a different way. Not by drilling straight down like a river, but by pressing and scraping across a broad area. And here is one of the quieter truths. A glacier is not just ice. It is a whole landscape on the move. It contains stones that were once ridges, pebbles that were once cliff faces, dust that was once the inside of a mountain. As the glacier slides, those tools grind the valley floor, making it smoother in some places, but they also deepen the valley, scooping it out slightly below the level the river would have chosen. This is why glaciated valleys sometimes feel overbuilt, too wide, too deep, like the landscape was made for something larger than the water that currently occupies it. You can stand in Yosemite and feel that mismatch. The cliffs are enormous, and the modern river seems almost shy. It wanders through meadows, making soft curves, as if it is trying not to disturb anything. But the valley does not belong to the river's personality. It belongs to the glaciers. To understand how ice can act this way, it helps to picture its slow motion honestly. A glacier is solid, yes, but it is also capable of flowing. The weight of the ice causes it to deform internally, crystals sliding past each other. The surface may crack in crevasses where the flow stretches, but deeper down, the ice behaves like something between a solid and a thick syrup. You do not need to be afraid of that. You just need to respect the timescale, because a glacier can move even when it looks asleep. It can work even when it feels still. And Yosemite was visited more than once. The valley's glacial story is not a single chapter. It is a stack of cold seasons separated by warmer gaps, each return of ice adjusting what the last one left behind. Some glaciers were thicker, reaching higher on the walls. You can sometimes see subtle lines, like old bathtub rings where ice once rested. Other advances were smaller, staying closer to the valley floor, doing maintenance work rather than full renovation. And all the while, the granite remained granite, stubborn, crystalline, pale in moonlight. not easily dissolved like limestone, not easily softened like shale. Granite does not melt away in water. It breaks, it cracks, it comes apart in blocks and grains. That is why Yosemite has that particular kind of dramatic clarity. The cliffs can be sheer because the rock can hold a face, and the joints provide natural planes along which blocks can detach cleanly. So when the glacier plucks, it often plucks along those joint lines. It takes what the granite already prepared. If you could listen closely, you might imagine the sound of it. Not a single crack, but a sequence of tiny adjustments. Ice pressing, meltwater slipping, a bond forming, a block finally separating with a muffled internal pop. Then movement again. The rock is carried, embedded in the ice, dragged along the base. It becomes part of the abrasion system. One stolen block becomes a tool for stealing more. There is a kind of bleak efficiency to it. The glacier does not bring equipment from outside. It manufactures its own. And yet, standing here in the calm air, you are not asked to be alarmed. The violence happened too slowly to feel like violence. It is geological, which means it is indifferent. That indifference can be comforting because it means the valley was not made for you. It does not depend on you. It will not panic if you misunderstand it. You take a few more imagined steps through the dark meadow. The scent is cold soil and pine, a hint of granite dust. Above, the cliff faces catch moonlight like dull metal. You might think those faces are unchanging. But even now, even without glaciers, the granite continues to respond to temperature. Warm days and cold nights cause small expansions and contractions. Water continues to find the joints. Tree roots continue to pry at tiny weaknesses with their slow, blind strength. Rockfalls are not rare here. They are normal. A cliff this steep is always deciding what it can still hold. But the main carving, the main widening, the unmistakable U-shape, that is the glacier's work. The valley is a space made by thickness, not sharpness, by pressure, not precision. And you can see it in the way the valley floor feels almost level. Not flat like a parking lot, but broad and gentle. A place where a river can meander, where sediments can settle, where grasses can take hold when the water behaves. That calm floor is the afterlife of erosion. Once the glacier did its deep scraping, it left behind a basin-like shape. Then, when the ice retreated, meltwater and river water began to sort the debris. Finer materials settled in quieter zones. Coarser materials stayed where it dropped. The valley became, slowly, a place where softness could return, and the cliffs became, in a way, the frame, the part that resisted just enough to remain. Now, keep the moonlight on the granite for a moment longer and let your mind widen its view, because Yosemite's glacier did not only smooth the obvious walls, it also paid attention to the smaller details, the rounded domes and polished shoulders that look almost too gentle for such a dramatic place. Those domes are another kind of clue, where granite breaks in curved sheets, sometimes from pressure release, sometimes helped along by weathering. You get forms that look like sleeping whales. Smooth backs of stone rising from forest. A glacier loves surfaces like that. It can ride over them, grinding them even smoother. It turns already rounded rock into something that looks deliberately sculpted, and it leaves behind those faint, linear marks the ice's handwriting stretched across the stone. You do not need to memorize every term, but it helps to hold on to two simple actions: abrasion, the grinding polish; plucking, the slow theft of blocks. Between them, a glacier can reshape a valley that once belonged to a river. It can widen it, deepen it, and leave it looking both severe and strangely softened at the same time. That combination is Yosemite's particular mood: hard walls, gentle curves, a place that looks like it was made by both force and patience, because it was. And now, as you stand in the hush, you can begin to notice those older shapes more clearly: the rounded shoulders, the smoothed slabs, the polished stone that does not match the sharpness of fresh breaks. Because once you have stood still long enough in the valley's quiet, you start to realize the glacier was not working with blank stone. It arrived to a landscape that already had cracks, rivers, and weaknesses, like seams in old fabric. Those seams matter because ice is not a genius with a chisel. Ice is a genius with a crowbar. It finds the lines that already want to fail, and it leans. You are walking now toward one of the darker edges of the meadow, where the valley wall begins to loom. Up close, the granite is not a single smooth sheet. It is a mosaic of planes, slightly different angles, faintly different colors: silver gray, pale tan, a wash of moonlit blue that is really just your eyes. If you drag your imagination across the rock, you feel the texture change. Some places are rounded, like they were rubbed by a giant hand. Other places are sharp, like the rock snapped yesterday. And that contrast is the whole secret of the valley's face. Granite is stubborn, but it is not unbreakable. It is a cooled, interlocked mass of crystals, yes, but it is also full of joints, and joints are invitations. A joint can be a clean vertical break, like a page in a book, or it can curve, forming sheets that peel away from a dome. That peeling has a name: exfoliation, which sounds like a spa treatment. It is really just pressure being removed and rock responding by cracking. Because granite formed deep underground under enormous weight, when the overlying rock erodes away over millions of years, the pressure drops. The granite expands a little and it fractures in broad arcs. The mountain does not explode. It just quietly lets go, layer by layer. You can think of it like taking a heavy box off a foam mattress. The mattress rises back up, slowly. Granite does a similar thing, only slower and with more consequences. Water helps, of course. It always does. It seeps into the joints when the day warms, when snow melts, when rain finds the smallest doorway. Then night returns, and the water freezes. Ice expands, and it pushes outward, widening the crack. This is not fast, and it is not dramatic. It is repetitive, like a bad habit that never quits. Over and over, the crack opens. A hairline becomes a seam becomes a plane of weakness, and a plane of weakness becomes a future rockfall just waiting for gravity to schedule it. Now, imagine the glacier arriving again during one of the colder pulses. It is thicker than the trees, thicker than the valley's current calm. It fills the whole space like a slow white tide, climbing part way up the walls. The glacier presses into those joints. It does not need to break fresh granite everywhere. It only needs to take advantage of what is already prepared. At the base, pressure melts a thin film of ice. That meltwater creeps into cracks, then refreezes. When it refreezes, it welds the ice to the rock, and then the glacier continues downhill. Not with a jerk, not with a yank you can see. With steady, patient pull, the way a heavy carpet slides when you keep walking. Sometimes the welded rock holds, sometimes it does not. When it does not, the glacier takes a block with it. That is plucking in its most honest form. A slow theft, executed with paperwork already filled out by the rock's own fractures. And because the glacier is not carrying empty hands, the stolen rock becomes a tool. It gets embedded into the bottom of the ice, and it scrapes along the valley floor. That scraping is abrasion, and it is the part people mistake for gentle. It is gentle only in speed. In effect, it is relentless. You can picture it like moving furniture across a hardwood floor. Not once, but every day for thousands of years. Eventually, the floor shines, not because it is loved, but because it has been worn down. That is why some granite surfaces in Yosemite look polished, not glossy like glass, but smoothed into a quiet sheen. You can imagine the glacier passing over it, loaded with grit. The grit is not just sand, it is crushed rock, ground finer and finer as the ice moves. Some of it becomes powder, rock flour, so fine it can stay suspended in water. It is the glacier's way of turning mountains into dust, slowly, without raising its voice. And there are other marks too, if you know where to look. Long scratches, parallel lines etched into bedrock, striations, like the ice signed its name and kept going. The scratches tell you direction. They tell you the glacier's path, the way a dragged object leaves lines on a floor. In daylight, you might crouch and trace them with your finger. At night, you just hold the idea of them like a memory you did not personally earn. Now, step back in your mind to the valley's larger shape. The Merced River is there, and it is moving. But it is not the architect of those towering walls. Rivers cut downward. They focus energy into a narrow channel, and they dig a V. Glaciers spread their force across the whole valley, and they widen everything they touch. That is why the valley feels overbuilt for its current water. The river meanders like a polite guest in a cathedral. It is small compared to the space it occupies. And it is not just Yosemite Valley. The same pattern shows up wherever alpine glaciers have had time to work. A broad floor, steep walls, and a certain bluntness, as if the landscape got tired of being delicate. But Yosemite's story has an extra layer of quiet complexity. Because before the glaciers, this region already had rivers, and before those rivers, it had uplift and fracture and deep, intrusive rock rising toward light. So the glacier is not the first sculptor. It is the latest one with the heaviest hands. You can sense that in the way some cliffs feel too clean to be only abrasion. Plucking creates steps and steep faces, especially where the glacier pulled blocks away. Abrasion smooths what remains, rounding corners, polishing shoulders. The valley becomes a combination of sharp absence and smooth endurance, a place where missing rock is as important as the rock that stayed. Now, let your attention drift upward toward the famous domes. Those rounded forms did not come from glaciers alone. They come from how granite fractures as pressure is released. In curved sheets, exfoliation breaks granite into layers. Weathering loosens those layers. Then ice, when it arrives, rides over the rounded backs and polishes them further. So a dome is both a structural truth and a glacial finish. The rock wanted to peel, the glacier wanted to sand. Half dome, despite the name, is not half because it was cut cleanly in half by a glacier. It is half because a large section fractured and fell away along joint plains. The glacier helped clear debris, and it helped smooth what was left. But the initial shape came from rock structure and from gravity's unsentimental housekeeping. You think you are looking at a monument. You are really looking at a partially failed piece of granite that happened to fail beautifully. And the failures continue. Even now, even without valley-filling ice, the cliffs shed pieces. Temperature shifts, expand and contract the rock. Water infiltrates, freezes, pries. Roots press into small spaces and slowly widen them. Rockfalls happen because steep granite walls are in argument with gravity. Gravity eventually wins, but it is willing to wait. This is not meant to make you uneasy. It is meant to make the valley feel alive in its own slow way. Not alive like an animal, but alive like a process. Because the valley is still being shaped. The glacier did the major remodeling, yes, but the everyday work continues, night after night, season after season. And when the glacier finally began to retreat for the last time, it left behind a valley with a particular kind of problem. It had carved the main trough deeper than some of the side valleys. It had widened the main corridor and lowered the floor. So when the ice melted away, water did what water always does. It tried to find the easiest route downhill, but the easiest route now included sudden drops, not because the land was dramatic, but because the ice had carved unevenly. The main glacier, thick and powerful, cut deeper. The smaller side glaciers, thinner and less forceful, cut less. When all of that ice disappeared, the mismatch remained. And the mismatch is why Yosemite has waterfalls that feel almost unfair. You can imagine it as a set of steps. The main valley is the lower step, carved deep by the big glacier. The side valleys are higher steps, left hanging above. So the streams that come down those side valleys reach the edge of the main trough, and they have no gentle ramp. They drop. That is a hanging valley. It sounds like something decorative. It is really a leftover imbalance, a glacial accounting error that never got corrected. Bridal Veil Fall, Yosemite Falls, and others like them are part of that afterstory. They are the sound of water adapting to a valley that ice redesigned. In spring, when snowmelt is generous, those falls roar. In late summer, they thin out, sometimes becoming a ribbon, sometimes fading to a damp stain. The rock does not mind either way. The rock has seen louder things. The steps are not only vertical waterfalls, they can be subtle breaks in slope along the valley floor itself. Where the glacier carved deeper in some stretches, it left basins. Where it carved less, it left rises thresholds of harder rock. After the ice, those basins could hold water for a while. They could become small lakes, then fill with sediment, then become meadows. A lake is often just a young meadow that has not finished becoming itself. So when you look across Yosemite's valley floor, you see softness, grass, open space. You might think it is natural in the sense of always being there, but it is more like a temporary calm. The river wanders because the floor is broad and relatively flat. It braids sometimes, it curves, it shifts its channel after floods. It drops sediment where it slows, and it picks sediment up where it speeds up. This is the Merced doing what it can inside a valley that is bigger than its ambitions. It is not carving the walls anymore, it is rearranging the furniture. And the furniture is mostly glacial leftovers. Gravel, sand, silt, and that fine rock flour. Material that was ground from the mountains and then dumped when the ice lost the strength to carry it. In places, the valley floor is like a layered archive. Coarser debris from faster meltwater flows, finer silts from quieter pools, organic matter from plants that grew, died, and became soil. The meadow you are standing in your mind is not just a pleasant open space. It is a basin that has been slowly filled, slowly leveled, slowly softened. There is a darker joke hidden in that softness. People love meadows. People build near meadows. People camp near meadows and then act surprised when water returns. Because meadows are often floodplains in disguise. They are flat because water has had room to spread out. They are fertile because water has dropped sediment there again and again. So when the river decides to wander, or when snowmelt comes too quickly, the meadow remembers what it is. It becomes wet, it becomes muddy, it becomes briefly more honest. Congratulations, you have chosen to sleep beside a river in a glacial valley. The ground is soft for a reason, and the mosquitoes will also be happy to explain it. Still, the overall mood after the ice is calmer than the ice age itself. The glacier is gone from the valley floor. The valley exhales. The walls remain steep, but the bottom becomes gentle. Water becomes the main moving force again, not as a carver of cliffs, but as a sorter and a spreader. And in the high country above, snow still falls. In shaded cirques, small glaciers can persist in colder times. A cirque is a bowl at the head of a valley, scooped out by ice. It is like a bite taken out of the mountain. Those cirques, high and cold, were the birthplaces of the old glaciers. Snow accumulated there, compressed into ice, and then spilled downhill. Even now, those bowls remain, holding small lakes called tarns. Tarns are often startlingly clear because the basins are rock and the water is cold. They sit in quiet hollows like leftover dimples from the ice's pressure. If you keep walking in your imagination, following the valley upward toward the higher elevations, the landscape changes. The air thins, the trees shorten, the rock becomes more exposed. You begin to notice more polished slabs, more rounded surfaces. In some places, you might see a line on the rock, a faint boundary between smoother stone below and rougher stone above. That can be a trim line, a mark of where ice once reached. Below the line, the glacier scoured and smoothed. Above the line, weathering had more time to roughen the surface. It is not always clear, not always dramatic, but when you know the idea, you start to see the landscape as layered history. Different textures, different ages of exposure. This is how you read a glaciated place, not by looking for a single obvious sign, but by collecting small clues. A U-shape here, a hanging valley there, polished rock, scratches, boulder piles that look out of place. Those boulders matter too, because glaciers are not careful about what they carry. When they drop material, they can leave enormous rocks sitting where no river could have placed them. A lone boulder on a smooth slab can be a glacial erratic. Erratic is a good word for it. The rock is far from its home, delivered by ice like a misplaced package. Sometimes you can match the erratic to its source by its mineral makeup. A darker rock sitting among pale granite, for example, a piece of a different world, quietly abandoned. Humans naturally give these boulders names. They climb them, photograph them, lean on them while eating sandwiches. They do not always appreciate the absurdity, because the boulder is not there because it is special. It is there because the glacier dropped it. It is a receipt from an ancient transaction, and the transaction was simple. Ice took rock from the high country. Ice ground rock into flour. Ice carried rock down valley. Then warmth arrived, and the ice melted, and everything the glacier had been holding was released. The release was not a single day. It was not a single dramatic summer. It was retreat, pulse by pulse, century by century. As the glacier retreated, meltwater flowed along its edges and beneath it. That meltwater could cut channels, sometimes under pressure. It could deposit sorted sediments, sand and gravel laid out by flowing water. So even as the ice did the heavy carving, water was already preparing the next stage. The glacier and its meltwater worked together, one grinding and plucking, the other washing and sorting. It is easy to imagine glaciers as purely destructive, but they also create spaces, and those spaces become habitats. Meadows, forests, river corridors, and cliffs that host nesting birds. The valley becomes a place where life adapts to the shape left behind, a shape that life did not request. And people arrive, as they always do, and decide the places for them. They build roads on the flat floor because flat floors are irresistible. They build lodges because humans like warmth and views. They map trails because humans cannot look at wilderness without drawing lines on it. Then spring melt comes, and the river spreads, and the valley floor reminds everyone it is a floodplain. Not every year, not always dramatically, but often enough to keep the park managers tired. And above, the cliffs keep shedding. Rock falls happen more often than most visitors realize. Sometimes they are small, a spray of stones clicking down talus. Sometimes they are large enough to send a dust cloud rolling through the trees. The valley is stable in the way a sleeping animal is stable, mostly calm until it shifts. But the great ice is gone now, at least from the valley floor. So you might think the major story is finished. It is not finished. It is just handed off. Because once ice steps back, the quieter processes take the foreground: water, gravity, temperature, and time. And if you follow the river out of Yosemite Valley, letting it lead you in the dark, you start to notice something else. The valley is not one isolated miracle. It is part of a whole mountain range that was written on by ice. The Sierra Nevada is full of glacial signatures: U-shaped valleys, polished granite, cirques, and lakes. Even the ridge lines tell the story, sharpened into arates or glaciers carved on both sides. An arete is a knife-edge ridge. It forms when two glaciers erode back toward each other, narrowing the ridge between them. It looks dramatic, but it is really just the leftover material between two scoops and a horn like the Matterhorn in the Alps, forms when several cirques erode into a peak from different sides. The peak becomes a pointed remnant, a stubborn center that survived multiple angles of attack. Yosemite is famous because its walls are enormous and exposed, but the processes that shaped it are not exclusive. They repeat wherever ice had enough time and enough weight. That is the unsettling comfort of geology. It is not personal, it is pattern. Now, keep following the idea of that pattern, because once you understand Yosemite as a glacial valley, you start to recognize its siblings. There are places where the same U-shape exists, but the valley is flooded. Water moved in, not as a river, but as an ocean. Those places are fjords, long, narrow inlets with steep walls, often calm on the surface. They look peaceful, like the sea is resting between mountains, but the shape is not a C shape. It is a glacier shape, drowned. A fjord begins as a glacial valley, carved deep, often below sea level. Then the climate warms, the glacier retreats, and the sea floods the empty trough. The ocean is not the sculptor there. It is the tenant moving into a space ice prepared. You can picture it like a bathtub. The glacier gouged the tub. Then it melted, and the ocean filled it. In Norway, fjords cut far inland, dark water beneath sheer rock. In Alaska, fjords are edged by spruce and mist, with glaciers still visible in the distance. In New Zealand, fjords sit under rain-soaked cliffs, waterfalls spilling down like loose threads. Each one is a familiar story told with different weather, and each one carries the same quiet clue, that blunt U-shape, now filled with salt water. If you drift in your mind from Yosemite's dry granite to a fjord's damp air, the sensation changes immediately. The air becomes heavier, loaded with moisture. The rock smells darker, like wet stone and moss. The water is deep, and it is often layered. Fresh meltwater can sit on top, lighter than salt water. Below, denser seawater pushes in and out with tides. The steep walls rise straight out of the water because glacial valleys do not waste space. They are efficient. They take the rock away and leave cliffs behind. And often, you will find hanging valleys there too. Side valleys perched above the main fjord, with waterfalls dropping straight into the sea. The same mismatch in carving power translated into a coastal setting. You might be tempted to call it beautiful, and it is, but you can also call it the aftermath of abrasion and plucking, dressed up in fog. Humans, again, try to live there. They build villages on the few flat spots available, small deltas where rivers have dropped sediment. They carve roads into cliff sides and drill tunnels through rock because going around is not an option. In Norway, some fjord roads cling to walls so tightly they feel like they were stapled to the landscape. In Alaska, there are places where there is simply no road because the geography refuses. Congratulations, you have found a coastline that does not want to be traveled. It would prefer you take a boat or leave it alone. And while you are floating in this imagined fjord, you can keep the glacier in mind, because in many fjord regions, glaciers still exist. Higher up, they still feed meltwater into the inlets. They still calve icebergs in some places, dropping chunks of ancient ice into seawater with a sound like a door slamming in a cathedral. Icebergs look slow and gentle when they drift, but they carry stone too. Small pebbles frozen into their base, grains of mountain carried out to sea. When an iceberg melts, it drops that debris. Stone falls through water and lands on the seafloor, far from its origin. That is one way glaciers extend their influence beyond land, scattering the mountains into the ocean. And the fjord itself often has a sill, a shallow ridge near its mouth. This happens because glaciers can deposit debris at their furthest reach, or because they carve unevenly, leaving a threshold of rock. The sill can affect water circulation. It can trap deeper water, making fjords sometimes low in oxygen at depth. Quiet surface, complicated interior. That is a theme you will keep encountering. Landscapes that look calm, but are built by violent patience. Now, shift again, gently away from the sea and back toward mountains in another part of the world. Because U-shaped valleys are not only an American story. In the Alps, for example, you can stand in valleys that are unmistakably glacial. Broad floors, steep walls, villages and farms occupying the flatness like they were poured into it. The Alps have a long history of ice and a long history of people trying to outlast it. Glaciers there advanced and retreated many times. They left moraines, piles of debris marking old ice positions. Moraines are not elegant. They are heaps, ridges of unsorted rock dropped by the glacier. But they are useful because they draw a line on the land, showing where the ice once stood. You can walk along a moraine ridge and realize you are walking on the glacier's leftovers, a pile of stones that never belonged together, dumped in a long arc. In New Zealand's southern Alps, the same patterns appear. Glaciers descend from high peaks into temperate rainforest. It is a strange pairing, ice and lush green, but it makes sense when you remember altitude. High enough, snow persists. Low enough, rain and forest thrive. A glacier can connect those zones like a conveyor belt, carrying rock and cold into warmth. And that conveyor belt is the quiet logic behind so many landscapes. Ice moves material downhill. Then water and gravity take over, sorting and spreading it. If you return your attention to Yosemite, you can feel that logic in the valley's floor. Not just in the meadows, but in the subtle rises and ridges that seem out of place. Those can be moraines too, though Yosemites are often less obvious than in some other regions. Still, in the broader area, you can find them. Ridges of debris marking where glaciers pause during retreat. A glacier does not always retreat smoothly. Sometimes the climate cools again for a while, and the glacier stabilizes or even advances. During those pauses, debris piles up at the front and along the sides. Then warming resumes, and the ice pulls back, leaving the ridge behind like a footprint. These ridges matter because they can dam water. A moraine can block a valley and create a lake. Over time, the lake fills with sediment, becoming meadow, becoming forest, becoming flat land that looks like it was always meant to be flat. But flatness is often borrowed time. Moraines are made of loose material. They can fail, especially if water pressure builds. In some mountain regions, moraine dam failures have caused sudden floods, called outburst floods. You do not need to dwell on that too much tonight. Just hold the idea that glaciers leave behind temporary architecture, piles and ridges that look stable until they are reminded they are just piles. And even in Yosemite, where the valley floor feels calm. You are living on deposits, sediments laid down by meltwater, by floods, by slow settling. You can imagine the valley after the last major ice retreat. The glacier has pulled back up toward the high country. The valley is raw, scraped, with scattered debris. Meltwater runs cold and milky with rock flour. As the years pass, the river begins to carve a channel into the deposits. It begins to meander. Plants begin to colonize the edges. First hardy grasses and shrubs, then trees. Where the soil deepens, life is patient too, and it follows opportunity. The river becomes clearer as the heaviest sediment settles out. But after storms, after rapid snowmelt, it turns brown again. A reminder that the valley is still being rearranged, and above, the cliffs continue their slow decay. Blocks loosen along joints. Sheets peel from domes. Talus piles grow at the base of walls. This is the long aftermath. The glacier did the big work, but it also left the valley steep and exposed. Steep and exposed is a recipe for gravity to stay busy. If you stand, in your mind, near one of the talus slopes, you can see the angular rocks piled like a frozen avalanche. Each piece has a story of separation. A crack widened, a bond failed, a block fell. Some talus slopes are active, with fresh, bright rock surfaces. Others are older, darker, with lichens staining the stones and softening their edges. And sometimes, the valley hears the sound of it. A sudden clatter, a deeper rumble, dust rising like smoke, then silence again, because the event is over and the rock has joined the pile. People sometimes treat rock falls as disasters because they interrupt the human plan. But for the valley, they are maintenance. The cliffs cannot hold every overhanging block forever. In a way, rock falls are the valley continuing to widen itself. Slowly. Not with ice anymore, but with gravity and weathering. Weathering is a broad word for many small processes. Freeze and thaw, yes. But also chemical weathering, even on granite. Granite is mostly resistant, but water can still react with some minerals. Feldspar can alter into clay minerals over a long time. The rock weakens, grains loosen, surfaces roughen. It is slow, but it adds up. So the valley is not done. It is never done. It has simply shifted from the loud patience of ice to the quieter patience of everyday change. And if you let your mind follow that everyday change outward, away from Yosemite, you begin to notice that glacial erosion is just one chapter in a broader earth habit. Move material from high places to low places. Grind it, sort it, spread it. Glaciers are excellent at grinding. Rivers are excellent at sorting. Waves are excellent at rearranging. Wind, too, has its own obsessive tendencies. But tonight, you stay with ice a little longer because there is another part of the story that is easy to overlook. When the glacier is working, it is not only carving valleys, it is also building landscapes out of what it drops. Imagine standing at the edge of a retreating glacier, not in Yosemite now, but in a generic, cold valley. The ice front is dirty, streaked with debris. Meltwater pours out in small streams, braiding across gravel. The ground in front of the glacier is a mess. No soil yet, just rock of all sizes, dumped without care. This is till unsorted glacial debris. If you walk across it, it feels unstable underfoot. Pebbles shift, larger stones wobble. Sand fills the gaps. It is the opposite of a well-packed trail, and yet, over time, that mess becomes land. Plants move in, roots stabilize it, finer particles settle. A chaotic pile becomes a gentle slope. Moraines are the ridges of that debris, but the outwash plains are the broader spreads. Outwash is sediment carried by meltwater beyond the glacier, often sorted into layers of sand and gravel. So glaciers create both the dramatic and the mundane. Cliffs and valleys? Yes, but also plains, gentle hills, and the kind of subtle terrain people farm without thinking about its origin. Even in places far from mountains, you can walk across glacial deposits. Large parts of North America and Northern Europe were covered by continental ice sheets during the last ice age. Those ice sheets were like glaciers on a continental scale. They scraped bedrock, they carried debris, and they dropped it across huge areas. They left behind rolling landscapes dotted with lakes. In some places, they left behind soil that would later become farmland. So when you think about glacial erosion, do not only think about scenic valleys, think about the quieter legacy, the sediments that become the ground under cities and fields. Because the glacier is not only a sculptor, it is also a delivery service, bringing rock from one region and leaving it in another. And the delivery is not always convenient. In some places, glacial deposits include clay-rich soils that drain poorly. In others, they include sandy soils that drain too well. Some areas are dotted with erratic boulders that farmers once had to clear by hand. Imagine being a farmer in a newly settled glaciated landscape. You plow your field and you hit a rock the size of a small car. You did not order that. The glacier did not include instructions. Congratulations, you have inherited an Ice Age's junk drawer. But the same deposits can also be gifts. Rich soils, abundant water in kettle lakes, gentle terrain compared to mountains. Kettle lakes are another glacial after effect. They form when blocks of ice break off a retreating glacier and get buried in sediment. When the ice block melts, it leaves a hollow that fills with water. So a lake can be the ghost of a melted chunk of glacier, leaving behind a depression like a missing tooth. This is the kind of thinking glaciers encourage. Absence becomes form. What is gone leaves a shape that remains. And Yosemite, in its own way, is a grand absence. A valley made wider and deeper by ice that is no longer here. Now, keep that idea in mind as you stand again in the moonlit valley. The Merced is still moving. The meadows are still dark and soft. The cliffs still hold their pale faces to the sky. Everything feels still, but the processes are ongoing. Water continues to seep into cracks. Temperature continues to cycle. Gravity continues to test the cliff's grip. And above the valley, the high country continues to collect snow each winter. Not enough to send a glacier back down to the valley floor? Not now. But enough to remind you that ice is never truly gone from a mountain range. It lingers in shaded pockets, in old cirques, in seasonal snowfields that survive into late summer. It lingers as cold water, as frost, as freeze and thaw, which means the valley is still connected to ice, even in its afterlife. And that afterlife is where so much of the landscape's gentleness comes from. The waterfall steps, The meadows, the wandering river, the sediment layers. It is the calmer phase of a story that began with pressure and grinding. A story that continues with sorting and settling. And if you follow that settling long enough, you start to notice where all the rock dust goes next. How the glacier's ground-up mountain becomes something you can walk on without realizing it was once a cliff face. That rock dust has a talent for disappearing into places you do not expect. You imagine it as a cloud of powder, and that is fair. But in the real world, it becomes a film on stones, then a smear in water, then a layer in the quietest corners. You walk, in your mind, to the edge of the Merced River. In the dark, it looks like a ribbon of moving ink. And even when it seems clear, it is carrying something. Not boulders, not drama, just the smallest grains, the ones light enough to stay suspended. Silt, clay, and that glacial rock flour, ground so fine it behaves like smoke. This is one of those gentle betrayals of nature. The most important work often happens where you cannot see it. A glacier does not just carve, it also manufactures raw material for future landscapes. When meltwater runs off a glacier, it tends to look pale and milky, not because it is magical, but because it is full of suspended flour. The water is carrying microscopic fragments of granite and other rocks, freshly shredded. If you pour that water into a quiet lake, the lake changes color. It can become an unreal blue-green, the kind people assume is a filter, but it is physics and geology working together. Tiny particles scatter light. The shortest wavelengths, the blues and greens, get bounced around. So the lake glows calmly with the leftovers of grinding. And when the water finally slows enough, those particles settle. The lake bottom receives a slow snowfall of stone dust. Day after day, season after season, a thin layer forms. You could call it sediment. You could call it the glacier's handwriting, falling to the bottom in a language of grains. In Yosemite Valley, the glacier that once filled this place is gone, but its dust did not vanish. It moved downstream, it gathered in low spots, it mixed with organic matter, it became soil. So when you stand in a meadow and the ground feels soft underfoot, you are standing on a recipe, crushed rock, sorted by water, darkened by decayed plants, thickened by time. Soil is not just dirt. It is a long negotiation between mineral and life, and glaciers contribute the mineral part in bulk, like a warehouse delivery you did not ask for. If you keep drifting outward, away from the valley's center, you begin to notice the shapes that mark where the ice once paused. Not the clean cliffs, not the polished domes, the quieter piles. A moraine is one of those piles. A ridge of debris pushed and carried by the glacier, then dropped when the ice lost interest. It is not sorted like river sediment. It is everything at once. Pebbles, sand, cobbles, boulders. All of it dumped together the way an exhausted traveler empties their pockets onto a table. And the shape of a moraine can tell you something personal about a glacier's mood. Not personal like feelings, but personal like behavior. A ridge across a valley can mark the glacier's farthest reach, the place it stopped advancing. A ridge along the side can mark the glacier's edge, where debris fell off like crumbs. Those are lateral moraines, running like rails along an old ice corridor. Sometimes, when two glaciers join, Their side moraines merge into a line down the center, a medial moraine, a stripe of debris riding the ice like a seam. None of these are pretty in the way a waterfall is pretty. They are more like evidence, proof that something heavy once occupied the space and then left. And because this is Earth, leaving is never clean. A glacier does not pack up. It retreats by melting, and it drops whatever it was holding. That means the landscape after ice is a landscape full of misplaced things. Boulders sitting on bedrock slabs like someone abandoned furniture on a sidewalk. Ridges that block drainage. Hollows that collect water. Some of those hollows become lakes. Others become wetlands. Others slowly fill and become flat ground that looks, to humans, like a building opportunity. Congratulations, you have found the flattest part of the valley. It is flat because it is a catch basin, and it will try to catch water again. If you want the most literal version of that story, you look for kettle lakes. They are common in landscapes shaped by retreating ice sheets. Less common in steep granite valleys, but the idea still matters. A kettle lake begins as a stranded block of ice. A chunk breaks off the glacier, gets surrounded by outwash sediment, and then slowly melts. When it is gone, it leaves a depression. The lake is the negative space of a melted object, a footprint that fills with rain and groundwater. This is one of the stranger comforts glaciers offer. They teach you to recognize absence as a kind of creation. Now, let your attention widen beyond Yosemite again, because the sediment story is bigger than any single valley. When continental ice sheets covered parts of North America and Northern Europe, they did the same work at a much larger scale. They scraped bedrock, they carried debris, they dropped it in rolling blankets called till plains. And those plains became the kind of terrain humans find irresistible. Gently undulating land, soils that can be fertile, water in abundant small lakes. In places like the upper Midwest or parts of Canada, the landscape is dotted with basins. Some are kettle lakes, some are scoured depressions, some are blocked drainages behind moraines. To you, drifting over it in your mind, it can look like a landscape full of scattered mirrors, water everywhere, reflecting sky, a quiet quilt stitched by melting. But that quilt comes with quirks. Till can be dense and clay-rich, draining poorly. Or it can be sandy and loose, draining too quickly. It depends on what the glacier picked up and where it dropped it. So 2 farms, 2 towns, 2 forests, separated by a short drive, can sit on completely different ground personalities. One has rich, dark soil that holds moisture. The other has sandy soil that drinks rain and stays thirsty. The difference is not weather. It is inheritance. It is what the ice left behind. And because ice sheets do not respect modern borders, their deposits ignore human maps. A moraine ridge can run across counties and provinces like a quiet spine. A band of rocky soil can appear, then vanish, then appear again. Humans eventually notice, of course. They name the ridges. They build roads along them because ridges are dry. They build towns on them because towns like not being flooded. Then they dig, and they find unsorted stones, and they learn, slowly, that their nice dry ridge is an old glacier edge. If you return to the mountain setting, where valleys are steep, and the ice was confined, you get another kind of deposit: outwash plains. Outwash is what happens when meltwater escapes the glacier and starts behaving like water again. It sorts sediment by size, like a tired librarian putting chaos into shelves. Heavy gravel drops first, close to the ice front. Sand goes farther. Silt goes farther still. Sometimes all the way into lakes and oceans. So an outwash plain often looks deceptively organized. Flat, braided channels, layers of sand and gravel. It can feel stable, like a foundation. But outwash is made of loose material. It can shift under floods. It can erode easily. And it can hide groundwater in its pores, which is great until you build something heavy and discover the ground is basically a damp sponge full of pebbles. You begin to see the pattern. Glaciers do not just sculpt dramatic scenery. They also create the quiet ground under human life, and that ground has opinions. Now, bring your mind back toward Yosemite's own after-ice world. The valley floor, the river, the meadows. This place is not an outwash plain like the ones at the edges of huge ice sheets, but the logic still applies. Meltwater came off the retreating glacier carrying sediment. The Merced rearranged it. Floods spread it. Quiet water settled it. So the valley floor is layered. Coarse gravels in some areas, finer silts in others. Organic rich soils where plants had time to build a dark skin. And the river, being a river, does not commit to a single channel forever. It migrates. Over years, it chews one bank and deposits on the other. Over decades, it can abandon bends, leaving oxbow shapes, wet depressions that slowly fill with reeds and mud. A river in a broad valley is like a bored pen on a blank page. It doodles, and every doodle becomes habitat. But even the river's doodling is constrained by glacial architecture. The valley walls are steep, the floor is wide, and in places, the valley has subtle steps, places where bedrock rises, forcing the river to adjust. Those steps are important because they control how the river behaves during floods. A slight narrowing, a slight rise can back water up. It can turn a meadow into a temporary lake. The meadow does not panic. It has done this before. Humans do panic sometimes because humans prefer landscapes to be static. They build campsites on flat ground. They put roads on flat ground. They act shocked when flat ground turns out to be part of a river's working area. You can almost admire the optimism. Almost. Now, shift your focus from the fine sediments to the coarser ones, the bigger rocks that glaciers are famous for dropping. Erratics. An erratic is a boulder that does not match the local bedrock. It is a traveler, a foreign object delivered by ice. In some places, erratics sit in fields like solitary animals. In others, they sit on bare rock, as if placed deliberately. They can be granite boulders on limestone, or dark volcanic rocks among pale stone. People like to imagine a story for them. A giant threw it. A flood carried it. Some ancient battle rolled it here. The real story is slower and stranger. The glacier carried it, frozen into the ice for miles. Then the ice melted, and the boulder was simply released. No landing ceremony, no explanation, just a rock sitting where it has no business sitting. And those boulders can become microhabitats. They shade soil. They collect moisture. They host lichens and mosses. They become the first hard surface for certain plants in a new landscape. So even a misplaced rock becomes a tiny anchor point for life. That is how the afterlife works. Chaos becomes structure, slowly, because life is opportunistic and geology is generous with raw material. If you keep following the sediment story downstream, you eventually reach larger valleys, then plains, then the sea. And along the way, glacial contributions become harder to separate from everything else. Because once the ice dust is in the river system, it is part of the planet's general circulation of material. Mountains to valleys, valleys to deltas, deltas to the ocean floor. A delta is just a place where the river loses energy and drops what it carried. It is a slow pileup at the river's mouth, land assembled, grain by grain. So glaciers indirectly can contribute to deltas. They help provide sediment and they help provide meltwater. In the far north, where glaciers are still large, meltwater streams can carry huge sediment loads during summer. That sediment can build braided river plains and then feed deltas into cold seas. Those deltas can be unstable. Channels shift, banks slump, and if sea level changes, the delta must adjust, which brings you to a bigger, quieter point. Glaciers do not only shape land directly, they also shape sea level, and sea level reshapes coasts everywhere. When ice is stored on land, sea level is lower. When ice melts and returns to the ocean, sea level rises. During the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets were at their greatest, sea level was much lower than today. Coastlines were farther out. Continental shelves were exposed as land. Then the planet warmed, ice melted, and the sea moved in. Not a single wave, not a sudden flood, in one day. A long, steady invasion, shoreline after shoreline retreating inland. So when you look at a coastline today, you are often looking at a compromise between bedrock shape, sediment supply, and sea level history. And glaciers sit quietly inside that history, like a hand on the thermostat. Now, drift back to those drowned glacial valleys you visited earlier, the fjords. Because fjords are not only about carving, they are about what happens when the carving ends and the sea claims the space. In a fjord, the walls are steep, the water is deep, and the air often feels heavy. It is a landscape that feels like it was built for silence. But beneath the calm surface, the fjord is layered. Fresh water from rivers and melting ice can form a lighter layer on top. Salt water sits beneath, denser, slower to mix. And because fjords often have that sill at the mouth, a shallow threshold, the deep water can become trapped. It can sit there for a long time with limited oxygen exchange. So the fjord can be strangely stagnant at depth. Life adapts, of course, but the chemistry is different down there. A calm surface, an isolated interior. If you are floating in your mind in a fjord, you can imagine the water darkening as it deepens. The light fades, the walls become silhouettes, and somewhere below, sediment continues to settle. That sediment includes fine rock flour from glacier meltwater. Yes, but it also includes organic material, dead plankton, tiny shells, the slow rain of life. So the fjord becomes a sediment trap, a place where layers accumulate, quietly recording climate changes over time. Scientists can core those sediments and read them like pages. Thicker layers of coarse material might mark floods or landslides. Fine layers might mark calm periods. Changes in microfossils can hint at temperature shifts. The fjord is a calm archive, even if it was carved violently slowly. Now, return to the place where ice meets the sea more directly, where glaciers still reach coastal waters, because this is where the glacier's work becomes strangely audible. You are standing at the edge of a tidewater glacier now, not in Yosemite, but in Alaska or Greenland. The air is cold and wet, and it smells faintly metallic, like crushed stone and seawater. The glacier's face rises out of the water like a frozen cliff, not smooth white, but streaked with gray lines where debris is trapped. The ice is fractured, creased, and blue in the deeper parts, and you think you are looking at something solid, stable, permanent. Wrong. You are looking at a river in slow motion, arriving at the ocean and breaking apart. The glacier flows into the sea, and the sea begins to undercut it. Warm water, even slightly warm, melts ice efficiently. The base melts, the face becomes unstable, and cracks propagate upward. Then a piece calves. It breaks free and crashes into the water. The sound can be sharp, like a crack, then deep, like thunder muffled by fog. Waves radiate outward, rocking smaller ice pieces, slapping against the glacier face. It is dramatic, yes, but it is still part of the same patient story. The glacier is delivering ice to the ocean, and with it, it is delivering sediment. Some sediment falls immediately when calving happens. Debris trapped in the ice drops into the water as the iceberg rolls and melts. Other sediment rides the iceberg farther out, then gets released slowly. So icebergs are not just floating ice. They are freight. They carry pebbles and sand, sometimes even larger stones, frozen into their structure. When those stones drop into deep ocean water, they create a special kind of deposit, ice-rafted debris, scattered stones on the seafloor far from land. Imagine being a tiny creature on the ocean floor, living in soft mud, and a random pebble falls from above. No warning, no reason. From your perspective, congratulations, you have been hit by a delivery from a melting mountain. And this is one of the ways scientists can tell where icebergs traveled in the past. They find those scattered stones in ocean sediment cores. They identify their rock types. They trace them back to source regions. So even in the deep sea, far from any glacier you can see, you can find the glacier's fingerprints. Now, as you stand beside this tidewater glacier, you notice something else. The water near the glacier is often cloudy, not just from stirred-up sediment, but from a constant flow of meltwater emerging beneath the ice. Subglacial meltwater exits at the grounding line, where the glacier meets the seafloor. It shoots out, buoyant and fresh, rising in plumes. Those plumes can stir sediment from the seabed, creating a cloudy zone. They can also draw warmer seawater toward the glacier face, increasing melt. So the glacier is not just passively melting, it is part of a circulation system, a conversation between ice, ocean, and sediment. And while this coastal ice story feels far from Yosemite, it is connected by the same basic mechanisms. Ice moves downhill under gravity. It erodes bedrock by abrasion and plucking. It carries debris. It drops debris when it melts. The setting changes, but the habits remain. If you drift away from the Tidewater Glacier now, following the coastline, you begin to see how glacial carving can rewrite the entire edge of a continent. Fjords cut deep into land. Islands form where mountains were dissected by ice. In places like coastal British Columbia, Southeast Alaska, or parts of Norway, the coastline becomes a maze. Narrow channels, steep walls, countless inlets. This is not the ocean being creative. This is the ocean filling a landscape. That ice overcomplicated. Humans respond the way humans always respond to inconvenient geography. They use boats. They build small settlements on the few flat spots. They accept, reluctantly, that roads are a luxury. And the few roads that exist often cling to slopes, crossing avalanche paths, dodging rock falls. In winter, snow shuts them down. In spring, meltwater tries to remove them. The landscape is not hostile in an emotional way. It is simply uninterested in being practical. If you keep moving along this imagined coast, you may find places where glaciers have retreated recently, leaving bare ground, freshly exposed rock, raw and pale. New lakes forming behind moraines, streams cutting into loose sediment, carving little gullies that look like miniature versions of larger valleys. This is the landscape rebooting itself. Primary succession, the slow colonization of bare ground by life. First lichens, then mosses, then small plants, then shrubs, then trees, if the climate allows. It can take centuries for a mature forest to develop, but the first steps happen quickly because life is impatient compared to rock, and while life moves in, erosion continues. Loose sediment slumps, streams rearrange gravel, rain darkens the dust and packs it down. So the glacier leaves, but the afterwork begins immediately. Now, gently pivot back toward the quieter piles again, because the sediment does not only create soils and plains, it also creates subtle hazards, the kind that do not roar until they do. Moraines can be unstable, especially when they dam lakes. In many mountain ranges today, glaciers are retreating, and new lakes are forming behind loose moraine dams. These lakes can look calm. They often sit in stark basins surrounded by rock and thin vegetation. They can be a perfect mirror in still weather. But the dam is not bedrock. It is a pile. If water overtops it, or if a landslide splashes into the lake, or if the dam is weakened internally, it can fail suddenly. The resulting flood is called a glacial lake outburst flood. The phrase sounds clinical, like a paperwork problem. In reality, it is a surge of water and debris racing downstream, rearranging valleys in hours. This happens in the Himalayas, in the Andes, in Alaska, in Iceland. It is one of the ways modern humans are reminded that glacial landscapes are not finished products. They are transitional states. You do not need to sit with the danger too sharply tonight. Just let it exist as a quiet detail, a reminder that piles of debris are honest about being piles. Now, return to Yosemite again, because the valley has its own version of this ongoing adjustment. Not moraine dam failures, usually, but sediment filling, river migration, rock falls, and the slow widening of cracks. You are back on the valley floor, where the river is calmer than the cliffs. The air is cool and the granite walls are pale ghosts against the sky. And you begin to understand that the glacier did not create a final shape. It created a starting condition for everything that came after. The waterfalls exist because the valley is over-deepened compared to its tributaries. The meadows exist because basins filled with sediment. The river meanders because the floor is wide and low gradient. And the cliffs keep shedding because they are steep, jointed, and exposed. So now, you can let the glacier step further into the background and watch the everyday forces take over. Because once the ice is gone, the planet does not stop working. It just changes tools. Temperature is one of those tools, and it is remarkably effective for something you experience as simple weather. During the day, rock warms and expands slightly. At night, it cools and contracts. This daily cycling creates stress, especially near the surface. Over years, that stress helps weaken the outer layers of rock. In deserts, where day and night temperature swings are large, this can be a major process. In mountains, it still matters, especially on exposed faces. Granite, despite its toughness, responds to these cycles. Tiny fractures grow, grains loosen, sheets can peel off domes, and water continues to assist because water is persistent and invasive. Rain finds cracks, snowmelt seeps into joints, even humid air can condense in cool fractures. Then, when temperatures drop below freezing, ice forms in those cracks, ice expands, and the crack widens. This freeze-thaw cycle is not a single dramatic event. It is repetition. A crack that widens by a fraction each year becomes a crack that matters over centuries. And in a place like Yosemite, where steep walls loom over a valley floor full of people, that slow widening eventually produces rockfalls. A rockfall is gravity doing paperwork. The cliff has held on as long as friction and geometry allowed. Then, one day, the balance tips. Sometimes it is triggered by heavy rain, sometimes by an earthquake, even a small one, sometimes by freezing and thawing, sometimes by nothing obvious at all, just the final moment in a long weakening. The rock breaks free, falls, hits ledges, shatters, and piles up at the base. Over time, talus slopes grow. They can bury trees. They can divert streams. They can create new surfaces for plants to colonize. So even rockfall debris becomes part of the valley's gradual filling. The cliffs erode. The floor accumulates. And the river participates in this housekeeping. When floods come, they can pick up smaller talus fragments. They can move gravel downstream. They can spread new layers of sediment across the floodplain. A flood in a valley like this is not just a nuisance. It is maintenance. It is the river reminding the valley floor that it is still an active workspace. In winter, snow accumulates in the high country. In spring, meltwater pulses down. In heavy rain years, the pulses are larger. The Merced swells, spills over banks, and deposits silt. Then it retreats back into its channel, leaving behind a thin film of new ground. If you could watch this over centuries, you would see the valley floor subtly rising and shifting, meadows migrating, channels moving, vegetation patterns changing. It is slow enough that humans can pretend it is stable, which is one of our favorite hobbies. Now, Widen your view beyond Yosemite one more time, because the long aftermath is not unique here. Every glaciated landscape goes through it. In the Alps, villages sit on valley floors shaped by ice, and rivers continue to braid and meander through those broad troughs. In New Zealand, rain and steep slopes trigger landslides on glacially carved walls, and rivers carry the debris to the sea. In Norway, rock falls and avalanches continue to modify fjord walls, while sediment accumulates on the fjord floor. The ice created the basic geometry. Then, weather and water keep refining it, and there is another quiet after effect that is easy to miss: isostatic rebound. It sounds like a yoga move. It is the crust rising back up after being depressed by the weight of ice. When a thick ice sheet sits on land for thousands of years, it pushes the crust down into the mantle slightly. The mantle behaves like a very slow, very stiff fluid. When the ice melts, the weight is removed and the crust begins to rise again. Not quickly. Millimeters per year, sometimes. In places like Scandinavia and Canada, rebound is still happening today from the last ice age. Land is rising relative to sea level. That means coastlines change even without global sea level change. Harbors can become shallower. New land emerges. Old shorelines become stranded inland. In a sense, the continent is still exhaling from the ice's pressure long after the ice has gone. In Yosemite, you do not see dramatic rebound like in former ice sheet regions. The glaciers here were large, but not continent covering. Still, the concept matters because it reminds you that ice does not just carve, it weighs. Weight is a kind of force that leaves invisible consequences. Now, bring your attention back to the granite again, because granite has its own slow chemistry happening while all this physical change occurs. Granite is made of minerals like quartz, feldspar, and mica. Quartz is stubborn. It resists chemical weathering. Feldspar is more willing to change. When water interacts with feldspar over long periods, it can transform into clay minerals. This process is called hydrolysis, but you do not need the name. You just need the feeling of it. Hard crystalline rock slowly turning into softer material, grain by grain, in the presence of water. This contributes to the development of soil and saprolite, a decomposed rock layer that still looks like rock but crumbles easily. In warm, wet climates, chemical weathering can be intense. In colder, drier alpine settings, it is slower, but it still happens. So Yosemite's granite, which looks eternal under moonlight, is quietly changing at the surface. Not melting, not dissolving away dramatically, just weakening, roughening, preparing itself for the next crack, the next flake, the next fall. And this is where the long aftermath becomes a kind of lullaby if you let it, not because it is gentle, but because it is predictable. Freeze and thaw, heat and cool, water seep and refreeze, rock loosen and fall, rivers swell and deposit, plants colonize and die, soil thickens, small cycles repeated, building a landscape's next phase. Even the famous waterfalls are part of this ongoing adjustment. A waterfall is a temporary feature in geologic time. It migrates upstream as it erodes its lip. Water undercuts the rock at the base, especially if the rock is weaker there. Chunks fall. The lip retreats. In Yosemite, the waterfalls drop over hard granite steps. so the retreat is slow. But it is not zero. Over thousands of years, the falls can move. Over longer times, they can diminish if the valley floor fills with sediment, reducing the drop. So even the iconic features people assume are fixed are quietly negotiating with gravity and erosion. Now, consider the valley walls again. With their clean faces, those faces are not only the result of glacial plucking and abrasion, they are also the result of how granite breaks and how erosion removes what breaks. A steep face persists because blocks fall away, exposing fresh plains. If the rock were softer, slopes would be gentler, covered in debris. But granite can hold a cliff, so the valley keeps its dramatic posture until it does not. Over very long times, even granite cliffs retreat, not by dissolving, but by shedding blocks. Each rockfall is a small retreat. The talus pile grows, and if talus is removed by rivers or debris flows, the cliff remains steep, so the valley can maintain its shape for a long time. Even as it changes, the geometry stays recognizable, while the details shift endlessly. That is one of the strange comforts of big landscapes. They feel stable because their changes are distributed and slow. Now, let your mind follow one more thread in this long aftermath. Fire. Yosemite is not only shaped by ice and water, it is also shaped by burn cycles. Fire alters vegetation, which alters erosion. After a burn, roots that held soil in place are gone. Rainfall can trigger more runoff, more debris movement. So a burned slope can deliver more sediment to streams. Streams can become muddier. Deposits can build up on valley floors. Over time, vegetation regrows, stabilizing the ground again. It is another cycle layered on top of the others. Climate and ecology feeding back into geomorphology, the shape of the land. And in a warming world, the timing and intensity of these cycles can shift. Snowmelt patterns change, vegetation patterns change, which means the long aftermath is not a static script. It adapts. But the core forces remain the same. Gravity does not resign. Water does not stop flowing. Rock does not stop cracking. So you can let the valley exist as a process rather than a postcard. A place where the ice did the foundational work and everything since has been rearranging the consequences. And if you let your attention drift, you can find the quietest truth of all. The valley is not fragile. It looks delicate sometimes with mist and moonlight and soft meadow grass, but it is built to be damaged. It was carved by abrasion and plucking. It has survived repeated glaciations. It has endured uplift, fracture, flood, fire, and rockfall. A landscape like this is not a finished sculpture. It is a working system, which means that when something falls, when a river floods, when a slope slides, it is not the end of the story. It is the story continuing. Now, take that idea and hold it gently, because it lets you see other places differently. The world is full of valleys that look calm until you realize they are simply between events. A river valley between floods, a mountain slope between slides, a coast between storms, a glacier between advances. Even ice itself, when it returns, does not return as a single dramatic wall. It returns as snowfields that persist longer, as fern that half-compacted snow that is on its way to becoming ice. As small glaciers in shaded bowls, Fern is a quiet stage, a middle age of snow. It has survived at least one summer. It is dense, granular, no longer fluffy. If enough fern accumulates, it compresses into glacial ice. So if climate cools again, glaciers can grow, not overnight. They thicken over decades, then centuries. They begin to move. They begin to erode again, picking up the work where the last ice left off. In Yosemite, that would require a climate shift significant enough to send ice back down the valley. Not likely in the near future. But the concept matters because it ties the valley to a larger rhythm. Glaciations come and go on geologic timescales, paced by orbital cycles and feedbacks. Ice advances, ice retreats, landscapes get reworked, and every retreat leaves behind a fresh set of deposits, a fresh set of steps, a fresh set of mismatches that water will spend the next warm interval trying to smooth out. So the valley is part of a pulse, a long inhale and exhale of ice ages. If you step even further back in time, you can remember that Yosemite's granite itself is part of an even older story. Magma intruding, cooling slowly, forming the Sierra Nevada batholith, uplift raising it, erosion stripping it, glaciers carving it. The glacier is only one chapter, but it is the chapter that made the valley's shape so legible. And now, in the long aftermath, the legibility slowly blurs. Scratches soften, polished surfaces roughen, sediment fills basins, vegetation covers bare rock. The valley becomes less stark, more lived in, more disguised. That is what time does. It does not erase the past completely. It layers over it. In some places, you can still find the glacier's most direct signatures if you look in the right spots. Smooth bedrock knobs, roche moutonnies, which is a French phrase meaning sheeprock, a rounded bump with a smooth upstream side and a rough plucked downstream side. It is a small, compact demonstration of abrasion and plucking. In one object, the glacier approaches, grinds the front smooth. Then, on the lee side, pressure drops. Water freezes and cracks. Blocks get plucked. So the rock becomes asymmetrical, a little hump that tells you which way the ice flowed. You do not need to chase the term. Just picture the shape, a stone shoulder smoothed on one side, torn on the other. It is the kind of detail that makes the whole story feel more real, because it is physical evidence you can touch. And then there are the striations again. Those scratches, in some places, they are preserved on protected surfaces, under overhangs, or on bedrock that has not weathered much. They are thin grooves, parallel lines, sometimes crossing where ice flow direction changed over different glacial periods. So the rock can carry multiple signatures, layered like overlapping handwriting. One glacier wrote one line, another glacier wrote another, and time kept the notebook. Even the domes, those rounded granite backs, can hold glacial polish. You can imagine the ice riding up and over them, compressing, dragging stones along the surface. And when the ice melted, it left the domes exposed, gleaming in sunlight, then dulling slowly under weathering. So the valley is an archive of textures, smoothness and roughness, polish and fracture. And now, as the everyday forces keep working, the archive continues to update. New rockfall scars appear as fresh pale patches on cliffs. Old scars darken as lichen returns. Talus slopes shift and settle. The river shifts its channel slightly after a flood. A new sandbar appears. An old bend fills in. These are small changes, but they are constant. And somewhere in that constancy, you can feel the deeper comfort of geology. Not that nothing changes, but that change has a rhythm. You can hold the valley in your mind as a place where the loudest sculptor, the glacier, has stepped away. And now, the quieter sculptors are taking their turn. Water, gravity, temperature, chemistry, biology, all working slowly, all shaping the aftermath. And speaking of biology, joining the work. There is one more understated way landscapes change after glaciers: trees. In Yosemite, trees can grow in cracks, on ledges, in thin soils. Roots follow fractures because fractures hold moisture and offer purchase. As roots thicken, they exert pressure, not dramatic pressure, but persistent pressure. Over years, roots can widen cracks. They can help pry loose blocks already weakened by freeze-thaw cycles. So a forest is not just scenery. It is a mechanical participant in weathering. And when a tree falls, it can pull up soil and stones, disturbing the ground. That creates small pits and mounds, microtopography that influences water flow and plant growth. It is subtle, but over long times, subtle becomes significant. So even the quiet presence of a pine on a slope is part of the valley's ongoing reshaping. Now, let your mind keep wandering along this thread of the long aftermath, because it naturally leads you back to sediment again. Everything does. When rock breaks down, it becomes particles. Particles move downhill. They accumulate, and the accumulation is never permanent either. A flood can remove decades of deposited silt in a night. A debris flow can bury a meadow under gravel. A rockfall can dam a stream temporarily, then fail, sending a pulse downstream. So the valley floor is constantly being edited. And if you zoom out far enough, you realize this is how mountains slowly lose their height, not by collapsing all at once, but by shedding grain after grain, block after block, into their own valleys. Glaciers accelerate that process. During cold periods, rivers and weathering continue it during warm periods. The mountain range is always being lowered, even while tectonic forces may still be lifting it. Uplift and erosion, a slow tug of war. In the Sierra Nevada, uplift raised the range, tilting it westward. Rivers cut into it. Glaciers later reworked the high country, carving cirques and troughs. So Yosemite is a product of both uplift and erosion. You cannot have a deep valley without high land to cut into. And you cannot keep high land without tectonics feeding it upward. The result is a landscape that feels dramatic because it is mid-argument. The crust pushes up, erosion pushes down. The valley is where that argument becomes visible. And now, as you linger in this thought, the pace stays slow because the processes are slow. The valley is patient. The planet is patient. And as long as you keep watching, there is always another small piece of the story to notice. Another way the aftermath continues, quietly, under the same indifferent moonlight. And one of the smallest pieces is the way the valley keeps trying to hide its own sharpness under a thin blanket of ordinary life. You walk past the dark outline of pines and you forget they are growing on a scraped granite trough. You hear the river and think it is timeless, but it is really just the current phase of a much older routine. When ice left Yosemite, it did not leave a clean, finished surface. It left a complicated floor, part bedrock, part sediment, part uneven steps. Those steps are why water behaves the way it does here, not just waterfalls, but the quiet pooling, the soggy flats, the places where fog forms low. If you could drain the valley and look at the bedrock shape beneath the meadows, it would feel strange. Not smooth like a river would carve it, more like a shallow scoop with little rises of harder stone. The glacier had the strength to over-deepen some sections, then glide on. And over that bedrock, the valley has been slowly backfilled, not by one heroic deposit, but by countless small deliveries. Flood silt, spring gravel, rockfall fragments, needles and leaves and decayed roots, a thin layer at a time the way a book becomes thick. This is why the valley floor can feel soft and deceptively calm. It is a skin over a much harsher shape, a temporary upholstery job on a granite frame. And the Merced keeps testing it each year to see what can be moved. During big runoff years, the river is less polite. It gets loud, it gets brown, it picks up sticks and stones. It spreads into side channels and low spots that look dry in late summer. Then, when the pulse passes, it shrinks back again, leaving behind a new thin layer of rearranged ground. You can call that nuisance if you are trying to park a car. Or you can call it the valley doing what valleys do. Because a broad, glacially carved floor is not a museum exhibit. It is a workspace that never clocks out. And out at the edges, along the base of the cliffs, the piles keep growing. Talus is not decorative gravel. It is the cliff quietly shedding weight, one loosened block at a time. The blocks do not need to be huge to matter. A small fall is still a retreat. The funny part is how quickly humans turn these active zones into scenery. You stand on a talus slope and admire the view. Meanwhile, the slope is made of evidence that the wall above you cannot hold forever. Congratulations, you have found the planet's most patient reminder. Even the cleanest granite faces are not as solid as they look. They are ruled by joints, and joints are ruled by water. In winter, water becomes ice, and ice expands. In summer, heat nudges crystals apart, just enough to keep stress alive. And because these changes are small, they feel harmless. But small does not mean unimportant when it repeats. That is the trick geology plays on you. It uses the same quiet motion over and over until the landscape finally agrees. If you let your mind drift farther from Yosemite again, you can see the same agreement happening everywhere. Ice once dominated. In Scandinavia, the land is still lifting itself after the last ice sheets. Harbors slowly grow shallower, not because the sea is leaving, but because the ground is rising. Old shorelines sit stranded inland like faded watermarks. That uplift is isostatic rebound, the crust recovering from being pressed down. It is the continent taking a long time to stand up straight again. No drama, no announcement, just a slow return to shape. And the idea is comforting, in a tired way. Even when the ice is gone, the consequences keep unfolding. The planet does not rush to reset. It just continues with whatever momentum is left. Back in Yosemite, you can feel that momentum in the simplest places. In the meadows that are really former wet basins, in the river bends that migrate like sleepy animals across the floor, in the way sandbars appear where the current loses interest, and above all of it, those cliffs remain scarred, polished, fractured, and still standing. They look like permanence because they change so slowly, but the valley is proof that slow change is still change. It helps sometimes to think of Yosemite as a series of phases rather than a single masterpiece. First, the granite formed deep underground, cooling in the dark. Then, uplift and erosion brought it closer to air and water. Then rivers began cutting a narrower valley. Then ice arrived and widened everything and lowered the floor. Then the ice left and water moved back in, sorting and settling. And now you live in the long, quiet aftermath, where weathering and gravity do the maintenance. None of these phases had a finish line. They just handed the landscape to the next process in line, like an old tool passed from one tired worker to another. Same job, different hands. And if you want one last simple takeaway from glacial erosion, it is this: ice is not gentle. It is just unhurried. It does not need to shatter rock quickly. It only needs to press and scrape and steel for long enough. Abrasion is the grinding polish, the glacier dragging grit across bedrock. Plucking is the theft, the glacier freezing to fractured stone and taking it along. Together they make valleys too wide for their rivers and walls too steep for comfort. That is why Yosemite feels slightly unreal. The river is small, the walls are immense, and the floor is broad and calm. It is an overbuilt space, designed by ice that no longer lives here. And now, under the same indifferent moonlight, you can let the valley return to what it does best. It holds stillness for a while, then it changes without asking permission. A small rock loosens, a grain of sand shifts, a thin sheet of water finds a crack. You are not required to witness any of it. The valley does not perform. It simply continues because gravity still points down and water still takes the easiest path. Somewhere up high, snow will fall again, quietly, into shaded bowls. Most of it will melt in spring and become river sound. A little of it will linger longer, tucked into cold corners, reminding the granite what ice feels like. And the Merced will keep wandering through the wide trough it inherited. It will drop silt in slow water and pick it up again when it speeds. It will keep rearranging the soft parts, because the hard parts were already decided. The cliffs will keep shedding blocks. Whenever the invisible math adds up, fresh scars will appear pale, then darken as weather and lichen return. Talus will creep outward, stone by stone, like the valley is slowly padding its own edges. And in the deep time scale, the only one the planet truly respects, another cold interval will eventually come. Not on your schedule and not with any concern for names or maps. Just a shift in sunlight patterns, in ocean circulation, in the long balance of ice. Maybe ice will return to these mountains in a way that matters again. Maybe it will not reach this far down. Either way, the same rules will apply, patiently, without opinion, so the last thing you do tonight is hold the valley as it really is. Not a postcard, not a monument, not a fixed place. A temporary shape in a long sequence of shaping. Granite under moonlight, still carrying old scratches. Meadow soil made from ground-up mountain. A river that seems quiet only because it arrived after the biggest worker left. And as your attention drifts, the stone keeps its steady silence. Time keeps moving like a slow